Paul finally returned home from the war, a wave of relief and joy washed over me, overwhelming my senses. The long months filled with uncertainty, anxiety, and fear had at last come to an end, and I felt as if I could finally breathe again. But as the days turned into weeks, a nagging, unsettling feeling began to creep into my heart, a sensation I couldn't quite identify. It was as if the shadows in our home grew thicker, more oppressive, and the silence became more profound and unsettling than I had ever experienced before. Each night, as I lay in bed next to him, I would listen intently to the house creak and groan, the sounds amplified in the stillness of the night. I would clutch the sheets tightly, my heart racing at every whisper of the wind that blew outside our window. Paul, however, seemed unfazed by the atmosphere that enveloped us. He would lie beside me, his breathing steady and calm, but I could sense a distance in him, a barrier that I could not breach, no matter how hard I tried. One evening, I was jolted awake by the sound of rustling paper. The moonlight spilled through the window, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. I turned to see Paul sitting at the desk, his brow furrowed in concentration, lost in whatever thoughts consumed him. I could see the flicker of a candle illuminating his face, but the light did little to chase away the darkness that seemed to envelop him like a shroud. "Paul?" I called softly, my voice trembling with uncertainty. "What are you doing?" He looked up, startled, as if he had forgotten I was there beside him. "Just sorting through some letters," he replied, his tone clipped and distant, as if he were trying to keep me at arm's length. The sight of him surrounded by stacks of paper made my stomach churn with unease. I sat up, curiosity piqued despite the dread that filled me. "What kind of letters?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He hesitated, his gaze drifting back to the papers scattered across the desk. "Just some correspondence from the war," he said, avoiding my eyes as if he were afraid of what I might see in them. A chill ran down my spine at his words. I had heard whispers among the neighbors, stories of soldiers returning home bearing the heavy weight of their experiences, stories that filled me with dread. But I had never imagined that Paul would be affected in such a profound and unsettling way. As the days turned into nights, I began to notice his behavior becoming increasingly erratic and troubling. He would often stare off into the distance, lost in thoughts I could not penetrate, and sometimes I would catch him muttering to himself, words I could not comprehend, drifting through the air like ghosts. The letters he received piled up, and he would spend hours poring over them, his expression one of deep sorrow and despair that made my heart ache. One particularly tense night, unable to bear the weight of the silence and the growing distance between us any longer, I confronted him. "Paul, you need to talk to me." "I feel like you're slipping away from me," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. He turned to me, his eyes dark and hollow, as if he were a mere shell of the man I once knew. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and strained, filled with a pain I could not fathom. "You don't know what I've seen." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I had always thought of Paul as my protector, the man who would shield me from the horrors of the world. But now, I felt like I was standing on the precipice of something terrifying, something I could not comprehend or escape. That night, as I lay in bed, the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe around me, and I heard a faint whispering sound. It was so soft that I thought I might be imagining it, but as I strained to listen, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the very walls of our home, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud, filling my mind with dread. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. "Paul!" I called out, my voice breaking with fear, but there was no response. He was lost in his own world, a world I could not reach or understand, and I felt utterly alone. The following days were a blur of dread and confusion. I began to notice strange things around the house that sent chills down my spine. Objects would be moved from their usual places, and I would find Paul staring blankly at the walls as if he were listening to something I could not hear. The whispers continued, growing more frantic and chaotic, and I began to feel as if I were losing my grip on reality, as if the very fabric of my life was unraveling. One afternoon, I decided I could no longer ignore the source of my terror. I approached Paul as he sat at the desk, surrounded by the letters that seemed to haunt him. "I need to know what's going on," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "What are those letters really about?" He looked up at me, his expression a mixture of sorrow and anger, and I could see the pain etched on his face. "They're letters of mourning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words aloud would make them more real. "For the men who didn't make it back." My heart sank at his admission, the weight of his words crashing down on me. "But why are you so affected by them?" "You're home now," I said, trying to understand. He shook his head, a look of despair crossing his face, and I felt my heart ache for him. "I never left." "Not really," he said, his voice filled with a haunting sadness that sent a chill through me. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt as if the ground beneath me was shifting, as if I were standing on the edge of a chasm that threatened to swallow me whole. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, desperate for clarity. But he merely turned back to the letters, his expression distant and lost. I felt a wave of frustration and fear wash over me, and I needed to understand, to break through the wall he had built around himself, but it felt impossible. That night, I could not sleep. The whispers had turned into a cacophony, filling my mind with dread and torment. I got out of bed and wandered through the darkened house, drawn to the desk where Paul spent so much time. The papers were scattered, and I felt a compulsion to read them, to uncover the truth hidden within the ink. As I sifted through the letters, I realized they were filled with the names of soldiers, many of whom had died in battle, their lives cut tragically short. Each letter was a testament to their sacrifices, their hopes and dreams extinguished. But as I read, I noticed something strange. Some of the names were familiar, echoing in the back of my mind like a haunting melody. I stumbled upon a letter addressed to Paul, written in a shaky hand that seemed to tremble with emotion. It was a farewell from a soldier who had fought alongside him, expressing his love for his family and his hope for a peaceful future. My heart raced as I recognized the name, Reg, the husband of my neighbor, Meg. Suddenly, everything clicked into place, and the horrifying truth washed over me. Paul had not returned alone. He had brought back the weight of the dead with him, their spirits entwined with his. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized that Reg's spirit was haunting our home, intertwining with Paul's very essence. I rushed back to bed, shaking with fear and confusion. I needed to confront Paul, to demand answers, but as I lay there, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a sinister energy that made my skin crawl. I could feel the presence of something otherworldly, something that had crossed the boundary between life and death, and it terrified me. The next morning, I found Paul sitting at the desk again, his face pale and drawn, as if he had not slept at all. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice trembling with urgency and fear. "You need to tell me what's happening." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a sorrow that pierced my heart like a dagger. "I'm losing them," he said, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his face. "They're fading away, and I can't let them go." "Who?" I demanded, desperation clawing at my throat. "Who are you losing?" "The men I fought with," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. "They're trapped, and I can't help them. They need me to remember them." A chill ran down my spine at his words, and the realization hit me like a tidal wave. Paul was not just haunted by memories, he was a vessel for the spirits of the fallen, their anguish pouring into him like a relentless tide. They were using him to communicate, to reach out to the world they had left behind, and I felt powerless to stop it. Panic surged through me, and I felt the walls of our home closing in, suffocating me with their weight. I had to get out, to escape the darkness that had settled over us like a heavy fog. But as I turned to leave, the whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind, calling to me, begging me to listen, to understand their plight. "Stay," Paul said, his voice a low growl that sent chills down my spine. "You can't leave." I froze, terror gripping my heart. His eyes had changed, the warmth replaced by an otherworldly intensity that sent a shiver of fear through me. "They need you too," he continued, his voice echoing with a chorus of voices that seemed to surround us. "You're part of this now." I stumbled back, fear clawing at my throat, my heart racing in my chest. "No! I won't be part of this!" I screamed, but the whispers enveloped me, pulling me closer to the edge of darkness that beckoned me with its sinister allure. In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. Paul had not returned from the war, he had become a conduit for the souls of the fallen, and now they wanted me too, dragging me into their despair. With a surge of adrenaline, I fled the house, the whispers chasing me into the night like a pack of wolves. I ran through the streets, the darkness closing in around me, suffocating me with its weight. I could feel their presence lingering, the weight of their despair heavy on my shoulders, as if I were carrying the burden of their lost lives. I didn't stop until I reached Meg's house, pounding on the door with frantic desperation. When she opened it, her expression shifted from confusion to concern, and I could see the worry etched on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with genuine fear. "Reg," I gasped, breathless and trembling. "I need to know about Reg. What happened to him? Please, tell me." Her face paled, and I could see the pain in her eyes, the memories flooding back. "He didn't come back," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He died in battle, just like so many others." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from my lungs. Reg's spirit was trapped, and Paul was carrying the burden of his loss, unable to let go. "He's with Paul," I said, my voice trembling with fear and urgency. "He's haunting us, and we need to help him." Meg's eyes widened in horror as the weight of my words sank in. "What do you mean?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. I could feel the walls closing in around me, the darkness creeping back into my mind like a suffocating fog. "We need to help them," I said, desperation clawing at my throat. "We need to set them free, or they'll never find peace." Together, we returned to my home, the weight of our task heavy on our shoulders. As we entered, the whispers grew louder, filling the air with a sense of urgency and desperation. Paul was sitting at the desk, his expression vacant, as if he were lost in a trance, trapped in a world of sorrow. "Paul!" I cried, rushing to him, my heart pounding with fear. "You have to fight this. You have to let them go. You can't carry this burden anymore." He looked up, confusion clouding his eyes, and I could see the struggle within him. "I can't," he said, his voice trembling with fear. "They won't let me. They're holding on too tightly." Meg stepped forward, her voice steady and filled with determination. "Reg, if you can hear me, you need to move on. You're free now. You don't have to be trapped anymore." The whispers grew louder, the energy in the room shifting as if the very air crackled with tension. I could feel the presence of the spirits, their anguish palpable and overwhelming. "You're not alone," I said, my voice rising above the chaos. "We're here for you, and we want to help you find peace." In that moment, the room filled with a blinding light, and I felt the weight of the spirits lifting, their sorrow dissipating into the air like mist. The whispers turned into a chorus of gratitude, echoing through the space as the darkness began to lift. Paul's expression shifted, the shadows fading from his eyes as he looked at me with clarity and understanding. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face as he finally let go of the burden he had been carrying. "I didn't know how to let them go. I was so afraid." As the light faded, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, a warmth that filled the room and chased away the lingering darkness. The spirits had found their way home, and Paul was finally free from the burden of their sorrow, the weight of their memories lifted from his shoulders. In the aftermath of that night, our lives slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The whispers faded, replaced by the sounds of laughter and love that filled our home once more. Paul and I found solace in each other, the darkness of the past giving way to a brighter future filled with hope and healing. But even now, there are nights when I lie awake, listening to the wind outside, and I wonder if the echoes of the past will ever truly fade away. The memories of those lost will always linger in the corners of my mind, a reminder of the sacrifices made in the name of love and honor. And while the darkness may return at times, I know that together, we can face whatever comes our way, united in our strength and resilience. Hope you enjoyed that spine-chilling experience. Now, let's move on to the next creepy tale. Ready to face more thrilling moments together? Let's dive into the next story right away. The relentless rain hammered against the windows as I stumbled into a small, dimly lit shop, seeking refuge from the storm. The flickering neon sign outside barely illuminated its existence, casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. For a moment, I hesitated, contemplating whether to turn back and brave the tempest outside. The wind howled, and the rain poured down in sheets, soaking me to the bone. The thought of standing out there, exposed and vulnerable, pushed me through the rickety door and into the unknown. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense mingling with something else I couldn't quite place, perhaps burnt wood, old leather, or the musty smell of forgotten memories. The shelves were lined with odd trinkets, dusty books with yellowing pages, and glass jars filled with mysterious substances that glimmered under the weak light. It felt as if I had stepped into another world, a place suspended in time, where the ordinary laws of reality no longer applied. As I wandered deeper into the store, my curiosity piqued. A figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall and thin, with sharp features that seemed to cut through the dimness, and piercing eyes that felt as though they could see right into my soul. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and inviting like silk. "I am Daniel Samuels. What brings you to my humble abode during such a tempest?" I hesitated for a moment, the weight of my life pressing down on me like a heavy cloak. My dreams had always seemed just out of reach, tantalizingly close yet perpetually elusive, and now I felt as if I were drowning in a sea of mediocrity. I muttered something about seeking shelter, but Daniel's gaze sharpened, as if he could sense my deeper desires. "You seek more than mere refuge, don't you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his expression almost predatory. "You desire success, wealth, power, perhaps even admiration from those around you." I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. "How do you know that?" I asked, a mix of fear and intrigue coursing through me. He smiled, a sly curl of his lips that sent a shiver down my spine. "I know many things, Gareth. I can help you attain your desires, but at a cost." An odd mix of excitement and dread washed over me. "What kind of cost?" I inquired, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel stepped closer, gesturing towards a tall, wooden table covered in an assortment of peculiar items that seemed to pulse with energy. "A part of you for each achievement, a body part, a memory, a feeling. In exchange, I will grant you the success you crave." I considered his offer, disbelief wrestling with desperation. What did I have to lose? A part of me had always felt like it was missing, and here was a chance to reclaim my life and my ambitions. With a shaky breath, I nodded, feeling a strange sense of resolve. Our first transaction felt surreal, almost dreamlike. I let him take a small sliver of my left pinky finger, a seemingly insignificant sacrifice. Without hesitation, he placed it on an ancient scale alongside a flickering candle that cast dancing shadows across the room. In a heartbeat, the scale tipped, and warmth surged through me, igniting a fire I had long thought extinguished. Instantly, I felt a newfound confidence, a sharp clarity in my thoughts. The next day, I aced an interview for a job that had long eluded me, a position I had only fantasized about. Success came quickly after that initial triumph. With each achievement, however, a piece of me faded away, leaving behind an emptiness I struggled to comprehend. I surrendered my sense of taste for a promotion, the small toe on my left foot for a handsome salary, and my ability to truly feel joy for a beautiful apartment that overlooked the city. I no longer recognized myself in the mirror. The reflection staring back was a stranger, a hollow version of the man I once was. Yet, the allure of wealth and power kept me tethered to the bargains I had made. As the months passed, my life seemed to spiral towards dizzying heights. I became a person of influence, a figure others looked up to with envy and admiration. I attended extravagant parties, dined at exclusive restaurants, and basked in a recognition I had once only dreamed of. But each success came with a silent price, an ever-growing emptiness that gnawed at my insides like a persistent hunger. I began to notice the whispers, the rumors swirling around me like dark clouds. People began to speculate about my rapid ascent, their eyes filled with suspicion. They called it luck. They whispered about a pact with the devil, a dark bargain made in the shadows. I brushed aside their comments, focusing solely on my next goal, my next achievement. For Daniel had become a phantom in my life, always present yet rarely seen, a distant figure lurking in the corners of my mind. Then came the day the cracks began to show, like fissures in a once solid foundation. I had traded so much of myself that I was now a mere shell of my former self. I stood at the top of my game, yet I felt a gnawing ache inside that no amount of success could fill. I looked down at my hands. They were pale and lifeless, devoid of the warmth and vitality I once knew. Each day, I felt more disconnected from the world around me, as if I were watching my life unfold from behind a glass wall. It was a cold night when Daniel finally returned. I was hosting a lavish gathering in my penthouse, the epitome of success, surrounded by the glittering elite. But as laughter echoed around me, a chill crept up my spine as the door swung open, and there he was, his eyes danced with delight, a predator reveling in the hunt. "Gareth," he called, his voice smooth as ever, dripping with a kind of honeyed malice. "You have done well, but have you considered what you have sacrificed along the way?" The room fell silent, the laughter dying in an instant as the guests turned to me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if all my secrets had been laid bare. "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, trembling with fear. "Only to remind you of our agreement," he said, stepping closer, his presence suffocating. "You have neglected the essence of who you are. Look around. Do these people truly care for you, or are they drawn to your status, your wealth?" His words cut deep, slicing through the facade I had carefully constructed. I glanced at the faces surrounding me, smiling masks enjoying my success, yet I felt utterly alone in the midst of the crowd. The realization hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. I had sacrificed my humanity for a fleeting illusion, trading my soul for hollow accolades. "It's not too late," Daniel continued, his voice a seductive whisper. "You can regain what you lost, but at a greater price." "What do you mean?" I demanded, feeling the weight of dread settle onto my shoulders like a heavy shroud. "Your life as you know it, everything you have gained, will vanish, and in return, you will reclaim your former self. It is a simple exchange, but your fortunes will be forfeit. You will lose everything you hold dear." I hesitated, torn between the life I had built and the remnants of the person I once was. My heart raced as I thought of starting over, the prospect of reclaiming my lost self, but the thought of losing everything I had achieved was paralyzing. Suddenly, I realized I'd lost my capacity to feel. My heart was a cold stone in my chest, and I was but a shadow of my former self. "What if I refuse?" I asked, my voice trembling as I faced the abyss. Then you will remain this hollow being, a king without a kingdom, Daniel replied softly, his tone almost pitying. Your choice, Gareth. With each heartbeat that went by, I felt time slipping away, like sand through my fingers. I looked out at the city skyline, glimmering lights reflected the life I had built, yet the shadows within me grew darker, more oppressive. The cost was high, but I longed for the ability to feel again, to experience the warmth of happiness, the delight and laughter, and even the sorrow that made life beautiful. In a moment of clarity, I clenched my fists, my resolve hardening. I choose to go back, I declared, my voice steady and firm, despite the turmoil within me. Daniel's smile widened, revealing a glimpse of something sinister lurking beneath the surface. So be it, he replied, his voice low and ominous. In an instant, a blinding flash enveloped me, and I felt my body being ripped apart, the weight of memories flooding back into my consciousness. The laughter, the warmth, the pain, everything I had traded for the empty promises of success came rushing in like a tidal wave. I gasped for breath as my world spun wildly, the faces of my guests disappearing into shadows, their laughter fading into silence. When the tumult subsided, I found myself in the street, soaked to the bone once again, the storm having passed. I clutched my hands to my chest, feeling the beating of my heart, a reminder that I was still alive. Glancing around, I realized I had nothing, no wealth, no power, just me and a dimly lit street, the remnants of a life I had once ruled. I wandered for days, lost and disoriented, the harsh reality of my choices settling in like a heavy fog. Hunger pangs forced me to scavenge for scraps, to rummage through the remnants of a world that had once been mine. Reality set in, and deep down, I understood, I had traded my existence for an illusion, a fleeting glimpse of greatness that had slipped through my fingers like sand. Now, I am a beggar in the city I once ruled, eternally waiting for Daniel to return, desperately hoping for a chance to reclaim what I had foolishly given away. The shadows whisper my name, a haunting reminder of my choices, and I am left with the only gift that remains, my humanity, the one thing I thought I could trade away without consequence. As I sit on the cold, hard ground, I can only reflect on the true cost of ambition and desire. I had been given a taste of greatness, a glimpse of the life I thought I wanted, but in the end, the price was my soul. And so I wait, longing for the life that slipped through my fingers, chained to a bargain I could never fulfill, forever haunted by the shadows of my past. Hope you enjoyed that spine-chilling experience. Now, let's move on to the next creepy tale. Ready to face more thrilling moments together? Let's dive into the next story right away. When I first moved into the old Victorian house at the end of Maple Street, I thought I was stepping into a quaint slice of Americana. The paint was peeling, and the garden was wild and overgrown, but there was a certain charm to it that drew me in with an almost magnetic pull. I was eager to start anew after a painful breakup that left me feeling raw and vulnerable, and this place felt like a fresh canvas waiting for my touch. Little did I know, it was also a gateway to something far darker, something I would soon come to regret not recognizing from the outset. It was on one crisp autumn evening that I decided to host a small gathering to break the ice with my unfamiliar neighbors. I went about inviting a handful of people I had met in the area, hoping to forge connections and perhaps find some solace in their company. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that reached ominously across the yard, laughter and music filled the air, resonating against the backdrop of the encroaching chill of night. The warmth of the living room contrasted sharply with the brisk air outside, and for a fleeting moment, I felt as though I was home. As the night wore on and the festivities continued, I noticed a boy lingering at the edge of my yard, swinging back and forth on an old swing set that had long since become neglected. He was small, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with tousled hair that danced in the evening breeze and a pale complexion that added an unsettling quality to his already eerie presence. His movements were rhythmic but utterly unsettling, he swung higher and higher, seemingly attempting to reach the moon itself. I could see his mother, a woman with tired eyes and a weary expression, hovering nearby, her gaze locked onto him with a mix of concern and exhaustion that was palpable. "Is he okay?" I dared to ask one of my guests, nodding toward the boy who continued his rhythmic swinging. "That's Tommy," she replied, her voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "He's different. Just be careful around him." I shrugged off her warning, writing it off as small-town gossip, the kind of thing that often circulated when someone didn't quite fit into the normative structure. But as the evening progressed and the atmosphere became heavier, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was indeed off about Tommy. He continued to swing, blissfully unaware of the other children in the neighborhood who played and laughed, completely oblivious to his presence. It was as if he was caught in a world of his own, suspended between reality and something far more sinister, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As the clock struck 10, the atmosphere in the room shifted uncomfortably. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that crept into the corners of the gathering. Tommy's swinging suddenly grew more erratic, and I watched, transfixed by an invisible thread pulling my gaze toward him as he abruptly stopped mid-swing, his body becoming rigid as if frozen in place. His mother rushed to his side, panic etched across her face like a mask of disbelief. In a swift motion, she pulled out a small vial from her pocket, shaking it nervously before pouring the contents into his mouth. The boy gagged visibly, his eyes wide with a fear that sent an inexplicable chill running down my spine. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid to disturb the delicate fabric of that moment. "Just his medicine," she replied, her tone defensive, as if shielding her child from the prying curiosity of the world. "He has episodes." The party gradually resumed, but no matter how much I tried to bury the memory of Tommy's terrified expression, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I focused on my guests, forcing laughter and indulgence in conversation, but an undercurrent of unease persisted like a dark cloud hovering above me. The laughter sounded hollow, the music distorted, slipping through my fingers like sand. I glanced out the window, and to my horror, I saw Tommy still swinging, but now his eyes were fixed on me, unblinking and hollow, as if he could see right through me into the depths of my being. The next day, I awoke to the harrowing sound of sirens blaring in the distance, cutting through the stillness of the morning like a knife. Rushing to the window, I saw a crowd gathered outside Tommy's house, shadows flitting about in a disconcerting dance of concern and grief. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I recognized the familiar faces of my neighbors, their expressions grim and foreboding. I quickly dressed, compelled by an unexplainable urge to know what happened, as if drawn by an invisible thread of fate. As I approached the gathering crowd, I overheard snippets of conversation that sent a chill racing down my spine, amplifying the sense of dread that enveloped me. "He was fine yesterday," one neighbor said, her voice trembling. "I can't believe he's gone." Panic surged through me, propelling me to push through the throng until I finally caught sight of Tommy's mother. Her face was streaked with tears, each one a manifestation of grief. She was being comforted by a friend, but the agony in her eyes was unmistakable, a haunting reflection of a nightmare come to life. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling, fear gripping my heart like a vice. "It's Tommy," she choked out, her voice breaking under the weight of her sorrow. He didn't wake up this morning." A chill gripped my heart with fierce intensity. I remembered the way he had looked at me, the unmistakable fear in his eyes as he struggled against whatever demons haunted him, fighting an unseen torment. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me for not doing something that night, for not understanding what I was witnessing, an innocent child drowning in darkness. As the days passed, the neighborhood became cloaked in a heavy silence, as though the joyful laughter that once filled the air had been snuffed out. The swing set in my yard creaked ominously in the wind, a constant reminder of the boy who had vanished too soon. I tried desperately to distract myself, throwing myself into work and mundane tasks, but the image of Tommy lingered in my mind, haunting my thoughts like a specter that refused to be laid to rest. One evening, unable to bear the weight of my guilt any longer, I decided to visit Tommy's house, hoping to somehow glean understanding from the echoes of what had transpired. I approached cautiously, the air thick with an unshakable tension that seemed to linger like a storm cloud. The front door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior that felt suffocatingly still. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my hesitant weight as I navigated through the shadowy corridors. The air was stale, filled with the scent of something sweet yet decayed, a combination that made my stomach twist. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness that enveloped me. No response. I wandered aimlessly through the house, drawn by an invisible force to the living room where a small collection of toys lay scattered across the floor, remnants of a childhood that had been torn too soon. In the corner, I spotted a photo of Tommy, his smile bright and innocent, an image of youth and joy. But something about the picture felt off, as if it had been captured in a moment heavy with despair and a deep-rooted sadness. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, a sound barely audible that sent my heart racing. I turned instinctively, but there was nothing and no one there. The whispers grew louder, engulfing me in a cacophony of voices that seemed to rise and fall like waves crashing against the shore. Panic surged within me, my instincts screaming for me to flee. "Tommy?" I shouted, my voice wavering as I hoped against hope for a response. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a tempest, drowning out my thoughts. I felt a cold breeze brush against my skin, and in that moment, clarity struck me like lightning. Tommy hadn't just disappeared, he had been taken. The darkness that had enveloped him was now reaching out, seeking to claim me as well, to pull me into the depths of despair he had known. I fled the house, propelled by fear, the whispers following me into the night like shadowy phantoms. I ran until my lungs burned, the shadows closing in around me, pursuing me with a hunger that left me breathless. I could feel their presence, a suffocating weight pressing down on me like the dark hand of fate. My legs finally gave way, and I stumbled into my own yard, collapsing onto the grass, gasping for breath under the oppressive weight of the revelation. Days turned into weeks, and I tried desperately to forget what had happened, but the memories clung to me like a shroud. I could still hear the whispers in my mind, feel Tommy's gaze upon me, haunting my every thought. I began to notice strange occurrences around the neighborhood, flickering lights that seemed to dance in anxiety, shadows moving where they shouldn't, and the swing set creaking in the dead of night, disturbed by an unseen force. One evening, I found myself inexplicably drawn to the swing set, unable to resist its pull despite the pit in my stomach. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the yard that seemed to illuminate the impending dread. I approached cautiously, the air heavy with an oppressive tension. As I reached out to touch the cold chains of the swing, I felt a chill surge through me, and suddenly, I was transported back to that night when everything changed, the night of the dreadful gathering. Tommy was there, swinging higher and higher, and his eyes were locked onto mine with a desperate intensity. I could see the fear, the desperation in his gaze, and in that moment, I realized he was reaching out to me, as if pleading for help. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the haunting creaking of the swing. In a surge of determination, I knew I had to save him, to do something beyond just watching him suffer. I closed my eyes, focusing on the whispers that had haunted me for so long. "I'm here, Tommy," I called out, my voice steady as I pushed against the turbulence of uncertainty. "I won't leave you." The wind howled around me, the darkness encroaching in a suffocating rage, yet I resolved to stand my ground, unyielding in my commitment. "You can't have him," I shouted, my voice rising above the chaotic void that threatened to consume me. "He deserves peace, a chance to be free." In that moment, the whispers ceased, the frantic energy dissipating into a profound silence that enveloped me like a protective cocoon. I opened my eyes, and Tommy was no longer swinging. Instead, he stood before me, a faint smile gracing his lips, his eyes no longer hollow but filled with gratitude that melted the weight of fear inside me. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice tender and warm, before fading into the night as if stepping beyond a veil that I couldn't cross. I felt a warmth envelop me, a sense of relief washing over me, dispelling the darkness that had plagued me for so long. The boy's suffering had come to an end, and I realized the heavy burden I had carried began to lift, leaving behind a stillness I had longed for. As dawn broke, I stood in the yard, the once sinister swing set swaying gently in the breeze. I realized that I had faced the darkness, stood against it, and emerged stronger, both for myself and for Tommy. The arena of shadows that had threatened to swallow me whole had receded, and I felt a sense of liberation surging through my veins. Tommy was finally free, and so was I. The whispers had faded into the ether, but the memory of that inexplicable night would remain etched in my mind, a reminder of the shadows that linger just beyond the light, waiting for those willing to confront them. Hope you enjoyed that spine-chilling experience. Now, let's move on to the next creepy tale. Ready to face more thrilling moments together? Let's dive into the next story right away. The autumn of 2012 brought with it an unmistakable chill that settled into the air, signaling the inevitable arrival of winter. My friends and I found ourselves restless, bursting with energy and craving a sense of adventure that only the warmth of camaraderie could provide. One particular night, charged with youthful enthusiasm, we decided to sneak out of our homes and embark on a journey into the woods that bordered our small town. This was not just any ordinary forest. It was a place steeped in mystery, woven with whispered tales of the unknown and stories that sent shivers down the spine. Little did we know, this night would irrevocably alter our lives. As we made our way through the underbrush, each step echoed the excitement in our hearts with the crisp leaves crunching beneath our feet. It was as if the very ground was alive, sharing in our secret adventure. The moon hung low in the sky, its light casting an eerie glow that filtered through the branches, creating a tapestry of shadows. Armed with a couple of bottles of cheap whiskey, we were eager to fuel the laughing spirit of the evening, unaware of the darker forces lurking just out of sight. Foster, our most daring friend and eternal thrill-seeker, led our little expedition with a fervor that was contagious. "Come on, guys. Let's find the clearing," he shouted exuberantly, his voice reverberating through the trees. We followed his lead enthusiastically, our laughter mingling with the rustling leaves, blissfully oblivious to the suffocating presence that awaited us in the darkness. Eventually, we reached a small clearing, a familiar spot we often visited during daylight but had never dared to tread in under the cloak of night. The atmosphere shifted palpably as shadows stretched before us, growing ominous under the moonlight. The wind sighed through the trees, as if sharing secrets we struggled to decipher. We settled down, wrapped in the warmth that coursed from our whiskey, letting it dull our senses and embolden our courage. "Tell us a scary story, Foster," I challenged playfully, a grin spreading across my face. His eyes sparked with mischief, and he grinned back at me, leaning closer as if to draw us all into his narrative. "All right, but you asked for it," he began, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, drawing us in. "There's a legend about a creature that roams these woods. They say it's the guardian of the forest, yet it doesn't take kindly to trespassers." As he spoke, the atmosphere shifted around us, and the shadows around the clearing seemed to thicken. "It's said that if you hear its whisper, you're already too late. It lures you in, and once you're caught in its grasp, you never return." Nervous laughter erupted, but it only served to mask a growing unease that I felt curling within me. The wind howled through the trees, and for a fleeting moment, just as his words sunk in, I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper, a voice in the darkness gently calling my name. I shook my head vigorously, dismissing it as a trick played by the whiskey or perhaps just the chill in the air. As the hours slipped by, we lost ourselves in tales and drank deeply, the world around us blurring into a hazy semblance of reality. But Foster, ever the ringleader of mischief, was keen to delve deeper into the woods. "Come on, let's find the old cabin," he urged, his eyes glinting with excitement. Despite a seed of hesitation nestled in my gut, we ultimately relented and stumbled onward through the trees, darkness enveloping us with each step. The light-hearted laughter gradually faded, replaced by an unsettling silence that pressed against our ears. It felt as if the woods were holding their breath, unseen eyes watching our every move, alert and predatory. Then, out of the grim silence, we heard it, a low, guttural growl that rippled through the air, sending icy tendrils of fear down my spine. We froze immediately, laughter evaporating in an instant, replaced with palpable dread. "What was that?" someone whispered, panic seeping into the tremor of their voice. However, Foster, with characteristic bravado, brushed it aside. "Probably just a raccoon or something. Let's keep going." But I could feel an unsettling knot of apprehension tightening within me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air was thick and oppressive, weighted with an energy I couldn't quite grasp. We pressed onward, but with every snap of a twig underfoot, my heart raced faster. It felt as though the woods themselves were alive and resentful of our presence. When we finally reached the cabin, it stood before us, decrepit and long abandoned, a shadow of its former self. The windows were shattered like teeth in a grimace, and the door hung askew on its hinges, as if refusing to welcome us. We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking ominously under our collective weight. The air within was thick with dust and despair, the pungent smell of decay clawing at my nostrils. "Let's explore," Foster declared, his voice echoing in the hollow silence. We followed him dutifully, though an uncomfortable gnawing sense of unease gnawed at my insides. As we progressed through the darkened rooms, the oppressive weight of being surveilled grew stronger. It felt as if we were intruders in a realm that did not wish to entertain our presence. Then, without warning, it happened. A whisper, soft and sultry, floated through the air like a beckoning promise. My heart thundered as I turned to my friends, their faces drained of color and framed in sheer terror. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely rising above a whisper, thick with dread. Foster dismissed it with a scoff, but even he could not mask the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "It's just the wind," he insisted, yet even he seemed to lack conviction. We huddled together, inescapably aware of the shadow pressing in around us, as the whispering intensified, urgent and demanding. Suddenly, Foster stepped toward the door, seemingly drawn by an unseen force. "I'll be right back," he stated distantly, and before we could voice our objections, he dashed into the darkness, leaving us suspended in a suffocating silence filled with dread. Panic surged within me as we shouted for him, our voices echoing futilely into the inky darkness that enveloped us. But there was no response, only the haunting whispers that mocked our cries, wrapping us in their sinister embrace. Minutes stretched interminably as we waited, the shadows drawing nearer, closing in like a shroud. Finally, unable to endure the tension any longer, I urged, "We have to find him," and we plunged back into the night, shivering against the cold air that gnawed at our skin. We called his name repeatedly, but the woods seemed to swallow our desperate pleas, leaving only the whispers echoing painfully in their wake. As our search deepened, the sense of unease morphed into sheer terror. The trees loomed over us like ancient sentinels, their branches clawing ravenously at the starlit sky. The whispers crescendoed, drowning out coherent thought. "Foster," we shouted, desperation bleeding into each syllable. Then, we heard it, a scream that pierced the night, raw and agonizing, ripping through the trees like a knife. It was Foster. My heart plummeted as I sprinted toward the sound, my friends hungrily chasing after me, pushed forward by nothing but fear. When we finally reached him, The sight was unfathomable. Foster lay twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide, frozen in an expression of sheer terror. I fell to my knees, my heart racing irrationally as I grappled with the horror of what lay before me. There was no blood, no clear signs of struggle, just the hollow, lifeless gaze of my friend staring blankly into the abyss. "Call for help," one of my friends shouted, but I was paralyzed by despair. The whispers that had once seemed distant now surrounded us, enveloping our minds, louder than ever, overwhelming and suffocating. It felt as though the woods themselves were alive, feeding on our fear and sorrow. We stumbled back, our eyes locked onto Foster's lifeless body, unable to tear away from the grim reality. "We need to get out of here," I gasped, my voice trembling uncontrollably. But as we attempted to flee, the whispers escalated, a chilling chorus beckoning us to remain, enthralling us with a sinister allure. In our frantic daze, we blindly barreled through the woods, the oppressive darkness consuming us whole. We ran without stopping until we broke into town, breathless and utterly terrified. We collapsed onto the pavement, the weight of what had unfolded crashing down like a storm. The police arrived shortly thereafter, their grim faces grave as they assessed the scene before them. They rapidly dismissed our frantic and incoherent explanations, labeling it a bare attack. I was overwhelmed by the impulse to scream, to reveal the chilling truth, but their eyes were cold and unyielding, and I recognized the futility of my words. In the days that passed, the town mourned Foster's passing, but within me, a relentless dread clung like a shadow. The whispers, once mere echoes, transformed into haunting reminders of that night, threading their way into my thoughts. I avoided the woods at all costs, my heart racing with memory every time I neared the tree lane, terrified of confronting the haunting specter of my friend's lifeless body. Years ambled on, yet the grip of fear never loosened its hold on me. I often sat with my father, enveloped in his stories about the woods, tales of lurking entities hiding in the dark, cloaked in mystery. "You have to respect nature," he would declare solemnly, his voice laden with caution. "There are forces out there beyond our comprehension." His words echoed persistently in my mind, a warning I dared not ignore. The woods were alive, their secrets wrapped in shadows, waiting to ensnare the unwary. I couldn't shake the unsettling intuition that Foster's fate served as a dire warning, a reminder that some places existed outside the realm of human understanding. As autumn returned once more, the familiar chill in the air evoked memories of that fateful night. I would lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the whispers from that evening haunting every quiet moment. I could still hear Foster's laughter, feel the warmth of our friendship, but it was forever swallowed by the overwhelming darkness that had claimed him. One particular evening, drawn by an inexplicable pull, I found myself standing at the very edge of the woods, peering cautiously into the sprawling shadows. The urge to retreat was almost debilitating, yet curiosity tangled tightly with my fear, urging me forward. Summoning all my courage, I took a hesitant step into the darkness, and like a floodgate, the whispers rose to a fever pitch, enveloping me. "Foster!" I called into the suffocating night, my voice trembling, laced with desperation. "Is that you?" Silence reigned in response, but I sensed a presence, something lurking just beyond the periphery of my vision, watching scornfully from the shadows. The air thickened, charged with an unseen energy, and the whispers collected into an unsettling choir, calling my name as if to entice me to venture deeper into the abyss. Panic surged like a tidal wave within me. The woods were alive, and their hunger was insatiable. I turned to flee, my heart racing wildly as the whispers chased after me, echoing through the trees with their relentless haunting. Bursting into the safety of my home, I slammed the door shut behind me, desperately locking out the dark. The whispers dulled to a faint echo, but the chill remained, hovering in the corners of my mind. I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face as the heavy weight of sorrow enveloped me. Foster was gone, swallowed whole by the woods, and I was left to ponder the fate that awaited anyone foolish enough to trespass into their realm. The fear settled deep within my soul, a never-ending reminder of that horrific night. I understood then that I could never return to those woods, never face the oppressive shadows that whispered my name. Darkness would forever be an ever-watchful presence, waiting patiently, lurking in the corners of my mind, and I would remain haunted by the memory of my friend lost to the whispering shadows, a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking just beyond the safety of light. Hope you enjoyed that spine-chilling experience. Now, let's move on to the next creepy tale. Ready to face more thrilling moments together? Let's dive into the next story right away. During my first year at college, I came across a peculiar phenomenon known as the lockdown. This strange occurrence would happen a few times each semester, and it always caught us off guard. The administration would announce a lockdown without any prior warning, leaving students scrambling to comply. During these lockdowns, all students were required to remain in their dorms, lock their doors tightly, turn off the lights, and maintain absolute silence. It sounded utterly ridiculous and somewhat surreal, but my roommate Theo and I quickly acclimated to this bizarre routine. At first, I found the lockdown unsettling and a bit nerve-wracking. The overwhelming silence felt suffocating, and the occasional whispers that drifted through the air sent chills racing down my spine. However, as time passed, I slowly began to adapt to this strange and eerie routine. During lockdowns, Theo and I would often entertain ourselves by playing board games or sharing scary stories to break the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded us. Theo had a knack for storytelling. His voice would echo through the dark room, pulling me into another world, making me forget, if only for a moment, the unsettling reality outside. But one fateful night, everything changed dramatically. It was an especially long lockdown, one that seemed to stretch on forever, and the school broadcast came on in the evening, announcing that we needed to lock our doors early for an unspecified reason. Theo and I had just started a game of cards when he suddenly exclaimed, "I need to run to the library to grab a book. I'll be right back." I wanted to remind him that time was running out, but before I could say anything, he dashed out of the dorm, disappearing down the hallway in a flash. Minutes ticked by, and the dorm grew increasingly silent, the stillness becoming almost oppressive. My heart began to race, and my mind filled with various scenarios, each more alarming than the last. I tried to focus on my cards, but anxiety gnawed at me, making it impossible to concentrate. The atmosphere of the lockdown started to weigh heavily on me, and the darkness around seemed to close in like a suffocating blanket. Every time I heard footsteps outside the door, I held my breath, hoping it was Theo returning to reassure me that everything was fine. However, as the hours dragged on, Theo still hadn't come back. A sense of indescribable anxiety and fear washed over me, creeping into my bones. The rules of the lockdown were strict and unforgiving. No one was allowed to open their door for any reason. I sat in the dark, staring at the closed door, feeling torn between conflicting emotions. Should I follow the rules, as I had been instructed, or should I risk everything to help my friend who might be in trouble? Just then, I heard a faint whispering from outside, the voice unclear yet urgent. My heart nearly leaped out of my chest. I wanted to listen more closely, but I was terrified of what I might hear. The voice seemed to call for me, sounding like Theo's, but there was something different about it, something that made me doubt who was truly out there. Was it really him, or was it someone else entirely? "Open the door, please." The voice grew more frantic, tinged with desperation and fear. Panic surged through me as countless possibilities flashed through my mind like a chaotic slideshow. If I opened the door, would Theo walk in as he normally would, laughing and carefree? Or was the person outside not him at all, someone posing as my friend? I recalled a rumor I had heard a few weeks back about students going missing during lockdowns. No one knew what had happened to them, and the thought sent a shiver down my spine. My hands trembled as I sat there, filled with guilt and fear. In the end, I made the agonizing decision not to open the door. Even though I knew it might be the worst choice I could make, I couldn't bring myself to take that risk. I felt torn inside, Theo's voice continuing to call out from the other side, filled with helplessness and despair. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to calm myself down and block out the chaos that was swirling in my mind. "Are you in there? I need your help." The voice outside became even more urgent, as if he was struggling desperately against something. I could feel him pacing outside, trying to find a way to escape whatever was threatening him. My heart raced, his words echoing in my mind like a haunting refrain. Was I betraying my friend by staying silent, or was I simply trying to protect myself from an unknown danger? The lockdown felt endless, my thoughts wandering in the dark, spiraling into a pit of despair. Finally, I decided to call the school's emergency hotline to report Theo missing, hoping that someone would take my concerns seriously. But when I called, I received a cold automated response that sent chills down my spine. "All communications are prohibited during lockdown. Please follow the rules and remain quiet." Despair washed over me like a tidal wave, as if the entire world was conspiring against me. Theo's voice still echoed outside, filled with helplessness and fear, and I felt an overwhelming urge to rush out, to tell him everything would be okay. But I knew I couldn't. I gripped the edge of the table tightly, my nails digging into the wood, trying to keep myself calm and collected in the face of the mounting terror. As time dragged on, Theo's voice gradually faded, becoming lower and more indistinct until it was barely a whisper. I realized my choice was made, and in that moment, my heart was heavy with guilt and fear. I had no idea what had happened to Theo or if he was safe, but I knew I could never go back to that moment and change my decision. Finally, the lockdown came to an end, and the school broadcast announced that we could unlock our doors. I stepped out of the dorm, filled with unease and uncertainty, unsure of what to expect. The hallways were eerily quiet and empty, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I kept calling out Theo's name, hoping against hope that he would appear, but all I got in response was silence, echoing my growing dread. When I reached the library, it was bustling with students who seemed to be discussing the recently ended lockdown, their voices a chaotic mix of relief and anxiety. I tried to spot Theo in the crowd, but no matter how hard I looked, he was nowhere to be found. A sense of dread began to creep into my heart, tightening its grip on me. Eventually, I found a classmate and eagerly asked about Theo's whereabouts, desperation creeping into my voice. His expression turned serious, and he quietly said, "Haven't you heard? Theo went missing during the lockdown. No one knows where he is or what happened to him." My heart sank like a stone, hit hard by the realization that I might have played a part in his disappearance. In that moment, I understood that my choice might have been wrong, and the weight of that realization crushed me. Was Theo facing unimaginable danger while he called out from outside? I couldn't bear the guilt any longer, my heart filled with despair and regret that threatened to consume me. I started searching for any trace of Theo, asking everyone I could find, but no one knew where he had gone or what had happened to him. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see him calling out from outside the door, his voice haunting me, accusing me of my choice to stay silent. I felt trapped in endless darkness, unable to escape the reality of my decision. Days later, the school issued a notice declaring Theo officially missing, and my heart was heavy with endless pain and guilt, as if everything was my fault. I couldn't face my classmates' gazes, nor could I confront my own conscience, which nagged at me relentlessly. In the days that followed, I often thought back to that fateful lockdown, reflecting on the choice I made in the dark. Every nightfall, I could hear Theo's voice echoing in my ears, reminding me of how foolish and cruel my decision had been, and I felt as if I was drowning in my own remorse. Eventually, I came to the difficult decision to leave the school, to escape this suffocating place that had become a prison of my own making. I had no idea what had happened to Theo or if he was still alive, and that uncertainty gnawed at my soul. My heart was filled with endless pain and regret, but deep down, I knew I could never go back to that moment or change what had happened. Hope you enjoyed that spine-chilling experience. Now, let's move on to the next creepy tale. Ready to face more thrilling moments together? Let's dive into the next story right away. It all began on a chilly autumn evening in Maplewood, a quaint little town where every resident knew each other's names and the secrets buried within were as rare as a clear sky in November. After a long sojourn in the city, I returned, eager to escape the suffocating concrete jungle and the relentless grind of urban life. However, I was soon met with unsettling whispers of dread that seemed to hang in the air like a dense, ominous fog. This was not the warm and welcoming Maplewood I had once known. Something sinister lurked beneath the surface. Within the span of just 1 month, 3 children had gone mysteriously missing. Their names were etched painfully into the town's collective memory, each one a haunting reminder of innocence lost to darkness. But it wasn't until the 3rd child, a sweet girl named Lily, was discovered that the true horror began to unfold, shaking the very foundation of Maplewood. Lily's body, lifeless and cold, was found hidden away in the woods behind the old church, once a place where laughter used to echo and joyous gatherings were held. Now, that same spot had transformed into a crime scene marked by the grotesque image of a smile, painted in blood across her pale, motionless face. What sent chills down my spine even further was the fact that her front teeth were conspicuously missing, an indication that someone had derived a twisted pleasure from her tragic demise. As a detective, I believed I had seen my fair share of horrors, yet this felt different, as if the very essence of Maplewood was being tainted by an unseen malevolence. I was called to the scene without delay, my heart heavy with the weight of what I might find there. The townsfolk had gathered in a chaotic yet somber congregation, their faces pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. They whispered to one another in hushed tones, casting furtive glances towards the tree lane, as if expecting something dreadful to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Determined to sift through the details of each case, I began my investigation in earnest. The first victim, a boy named Tommy, had vanished while playing in his own backyard. The second, a girl named Sarah, was last seen walking home from school, her cheerful demeanor abruptly snuffed out like a candle in a fierce wind. And now there was Lily. Each child had been taken from their safe spaces, their young lives extinguished in a manner that felt both brutal and senseless. It was the unsettling details that gnawed at me relentlessly. Each child had been found with that same bloodied smile painted across their face and their front teeth disturbingly missing. As I delved deeper into the history of the town and its people, I stumbled upon a name that sent shivers down my spine: Jack. 30 years ago, he was just a boy like any other, full of life, laughter, and dreams. But tragedy struck when he met an untimely end, drowning in the very same woods where Lily's body was eventually discovered. His father, consumed by an overwhelming grief that few could understand, had taken his own life shortly thereafter, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and despair that seemed to seep into the very soil of Maplewood itself. The more I learned about Jack, the more I felt an eerie connection to the unfolding case. It was as if his spirit lingered, seeking not just justice, but perhaps revenge for the wrongs he had endured in life. I began to uncover the terrible truth that Jack had been a social outcast, subjected to relentless bullying by the other children. The laughter that had once surrounded him had turned into cruel taunts, and in the end, he had found himself abandoned by those who were supposed to stand by him as friends. His story was one of betrayal that reverberated like a dark echo in a cavern, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the recent murders were somehow tied to his tragic fate. As I pieced together the fragments of this horrifying puzzle, I began to notice strange occurrences around town, things that gnawed at my sense of security. Shadows flickered at the corners of my vision, and I would hear whispers in the wind, faint and sorrowful, voices that seemed to lament something long since lost. The townsfolk grew increasingly restless, their fear palpable and suffocating. They spoke in hushed tones of ancient curses and vengeful spirits, of a boy who had never truly left this world. At first, I dismissed their superstitions as mere ramblings of frightened souls. However, as the nights grew darker and more chaotic, I couldn't help but wonder if there was perhaps more truth to their fears than I initially wanted to believe. One fateful night, I made the decision to confront the very woods where Jack had met his end. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my resolve, I ventured into the consuming darkness, my heart pounding in my chest like a tribal drumbeat. The trees loomed overhead, their gnarly branches twisting and turning like skeletal fingers reaching out desperately for the sky. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt an unsettling chill seep into the air, a foreboding presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, whispering warnings that I struggled to ignore. Suddenly, I heard a soft giggle, a sound so innocent yet utterly out of place in the oppressive silence that surrounded me. The sound reverberated through the air, and I turned instinctively, shining my flashlight into the shadows, but there was nothing there, only darkness staring back at me. My heart raced as I pressed onward, determined to uncover the truth that lay hidden amidst the suffocating gloom. That's when I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated treehouse, its wooden planks rotting away and covered in layers of moss and decay. It was a place where children once played joyfully, a sanctuary of laughter now turned to dust and dismay. As I approached the eerie structure, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me like a tidal wave. The door creaked open, almost as if it were inviting me inside to confront whatever hauntings lay within, and against my better judgment, I stepped over the threshold. The air enveloped me in a thick, suffocating haze, laced with the scent of decay that clawed at my senses. As I scanned the interior room, my breath caught in my throat. There, plastered on the wall, was a mural of smiling faces, each one strikingly familiar. The children of Maplewood, their eyes wide with deceptive joy, yet their smiles twisted into something undeniably sinister. In that soul-crushing moment, I understood the horrifying truth. Jack wasn't just a victim, he was a puppeteer, pulling the strings of fate from beyond the grave. The missing teeth, the bloodied smiles, they were messages from a tormented soul, warnings that begged to be heeded. The town had forgotten him entirely, cast him aside like a piece of discarded refuse, and now he sought to remind them of their sins, his anguished spirit crying out for recognition. Desperate to alert the others in town, I rushed back, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and urgency. But as I reached the center square, I was met with complete chaos. The townsfolk had gathered in a frenzy, their faces contorted in overwhelming fright. They spoke of shadows lurking in every corner of their homes, of laughter echoing with a malicious glee in the dark night. It was as if Jack had unleashed a terror that could no longer be contained, spilling forth into the lives of everyone around. As the night wore on, the atmosphere thickened into something almost suffocating, imbued with an unmistakable sense of dread. I could feel Jack's presence pressing in on me, his anger radiating like heat from a burning flame. I knew we had to confront him, to bring an end to the cycle of violence that had plagued Maplewood for decades upon decades. But how does one confront a spirit consumed by vengeance? How does one face the embodiment of rage and betrayal? With the desperate townsfolk gathered around me, I led them into the woods where we formed a trembling circle around the treehouse's looming shadow. The air crackled with an unearthly tension as I called out to Jack, pleading for his understanding. I spoke earnestly of the injustices he had faced during his brief life, of the pain he had endured at the hands of those who should have cared for him. I begged him to find peace amongst the ashes of his anger, to let go of the burdens that had shackled his spirit. But as I spoke, something shifted. The ground trembled violently beneath us. I could feel the earth shake in response to our calls. The trees swayed ominously, as if caught in a great gale, and an unearthly wail filled the air around us, a sound that clawed at my very soul. Jack's spirit was furious, his wrath unleashed upon the town that had so egregiously wronged him. The bloodied smiles of the children echoed like sinister laughter in the shadows, their once innocent joy transformed into a twisted symphony of despair. In that harrowing moment, I realized with dreadful clarity that Jack's revenge would not cease until he had claimed what he believed was his due. The townsfolk fell to their knees, faces pale and pleading, begging for his forgiveness, but it was clear we were far too late. The cycle of violence had begun anew, and there was no stopping the relentless tide. As the night wore on, I bore witness to the horror that unfolded around me, the shadows creeping in to consume the town, one by one. The once joyful laughter of children transformed into piercing screams of terror, and the bloodied smiles of the damned only seemed to grow wider. Jack had reclaimed his sinister power, and surely Maplewood would never be the same again. In the end, I stood alone in the enveloping darkness, a mere witness to the horrors that had swept through my home. The once vibrant town I had loved was now nothing more than a ghostly shell, forever haunted by the memories of those who had perished at the hands of a restless spirit. I had tried so desperately to save them, to end the vicious cycle of revenge, but it became chillingly clear that Jack's spirit would not rest until he had claimed his final victory. As I turned to leave the ruins of Maplewood, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and I knew with startling clarity that Jack was watching. His malevolent laughter echoed in my ears, a chilling reminder that some stories never truly come to an end. The haunting of Maplewood would persist, an enduring tale of vengeance and sorrow that would echo through the ages, serving as a stark reminder of the darkness that lurks within us all, just waiting for the right moment to rise up and consume everything in its path. Hope you enjoyed that spine-chilling experience. Now, let's move on to the next creepy tale. Ready to face more thrilling moments together? Let's dive into the next story right away. It all began innocently enough, with a softness that felt almost magical. My girlfriend, Mia, was always a bit of a dreamer, often lost in the world of dreams and talking in her sleep. At first, this nightly chatter seemed simply adorable, sweet nothings that filled my heart with warmth and joy. I would often smile, amused as she mumbled about silly things that made no sense, her voice dancing through the layers of sleep like a gentle lullaby that transcended reality. I found comfort in these tender moments, a nightly reminder of the love we shared. But as time wore on, things began to shift in a way that I could never have anticipated. One fateful night, I found myself lying in bed next to her, the soft glow of the moon casting shadows across our dimly lit room. Everything felt serene and peaceful. At first, Mia was murmuring softly about a picnic we had planned for the weekend, her tone light and carefree, as if the world was a beautiful place filled with endless possibilities. However, as the night deepened, I began to notice a subtle but unsettling shift in her words. "Help me," she whispered suddenly, her voice trembling like the fragile flutter of a dying leaf caught in a fleeting breeze. My heart sank, and I brushed it off as just another one of her dreamy episodes, but deep inside, I felt an inexplicable unease unfurling within me, like dark tendrils creeping through my mind, wrapping around my thoughts. It was the next night when everything truly changed. Mia lay beside me, her face serene and calm under the moonlight at first, but as the clock ticked away into the early hours of the morning, something morphed within her, something I could not comprehend. Suddenly, she bolted upright, her once vibrant and lively eyes now vacant and hollow, devoid of the warmth that usually filled them. I gasped, the hairs on my neck standing on end as a wave of cold dread washed over me. "Darling," she intoned, but it wasn't her usual sweet voice that I adored. Instead, it resonated deeper, echoing in a way that sent chills down my spine, saturated with an unnatural aura that slithered under my skin. The way she stared at me with those lifeless eyes, as if I were some unrecognizable figure from a nightmare, sent icy tendrils of fear wrapping around my heart and squeezing it relentlessly. "Mia? Are you okay?" I stammered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I reached out, hoping to bring her back to me. She didn't respond. Instead, her lips curled into a twisted, almost grotesque smile, revealing an eerie stillness that felt far beyond her control. It was as if she was being puppeteered, her body a vessel for something sinister that had taken hold. In that dreadful moment, I was struck by a deep-seated dread that rooted itself within my soul. Though I had Mia physically present, somehow, the essence of who she was had vanished, and something dark and foreboding had taken her place. For the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in our once happy home grew progressively more oppressive, a weight that felt heavier with each passing night. Each evening, Mia would begin to speak in tongues, her voice slipping further and further from the person I once loved, each utterance laced with an unfathomable darkness. I watched helplessly as fear consumed her, her once joyful laughter transformed into harrowing cries for help that chilled me to the bone. I desperately tried to reach out, to comfort her, to bring her back to the surface, but each attempt was met with snarls that resembled more of a wild animal than the woman I had cherished for so long. Desperate for answers and feeling increasingly overwhelmed, I sought the help of a local psychic. The woman, old and frail with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see into my very soul, took one look at my trembling hands and declared, "She's not herself. There's a darkness clinging to her, feeding off her spirit in a way that I cannot articulate." Her words sent chills racing through me, igniting a sense of urgency I could no longer ignore. The psychic urged me to contact a priest known for his expertise in dealing with the supernatural, a real exorcist who possessed the strength and knowledge to confront such dark forces. I hesitated, disbelief gnawing at me from within. I was not the type to indulge in stories of the supernatural, yet as the nights grew darker and Mia's transformations intensified, I knew I had no other choice but to seek help. The day the exorcist arrived felt heavy with anticipation, like the thick air just before a violent storm. Father Anton was a robust man, with a presence that was both commanding and comforting, effortlessly drawing attention as he entered our home. As he stepped into our living room, a noticeable shift occurred in the atmosphere, a palpable tension hanging thickly in the air. It felt as if the very world around us held its breath, a silent promise that he would confront the evil that had invaded our lives. "Mia," he called softly, his voice steady and level, filled with authority. However, instead of the woman I loved, a low, guttural laugh erupted from her throat, a sound that clawed at my sanity, slicing through the fragile veneer of hope I clung to so desperately. "Leave. He cannot save you," she hissed, her face contorting in ways I never thought possible, a mask twisted by an unspeakable horror. Unfazed by her taunts, Father Anton stepped closer, unwavering in his resolve. He began to chant ancient incantations, his voice rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence like the tide sweeping in and out. But the darkness that had invaded Mia raged back with chaotic force, unrestrained and fierce. In that moment, her body twisted as if in pain, yet not under her own control. Something far more malevolent had firmly taken the reins, and I felt helpless to stop it. Suddenly, with a violent crash, my cat, Jasper, leapt from the shadowy corner of the room, hissing and clawing at the air like a creature possessed. It felt as if the very same force that was controlling Mia had suddenly shifted its focus onto him, as if he too had become a pawn in this dark game. He writhed and twisted, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and I realized too late that both Mia and Jasper were victims, entrapped by a malevolence far beyond my understanding. Panic settled heavily in my chest as I watched the exorcism unfold, feeling utterly powerless. The room filled with the acrid aroma of burnt sage, a sharp contrast to the sweet scent of our home, and the walls seemed to buzz with an unseen energy. I could see Father Anton straining against the ferocity of the evil, sweat beading on his furrowed brow as he raised a crucifix high, demanding the dark entity to flee. "Release them," he shouted, his voice a thunderous roar that seemed to resonate deep within my bones. The air thickened with tension, and I stood frozen, heart racing as I bore witness to this horrifying battle. As the struggle raged on, I felt a darkness creeping insidiously into my own heart. It was as though the malevolence twisting around Mia and Jasper was attempting to ensnare me too, to drag me down into its depths of despair. I fought against the urge to succumb, forcing myself to focus on the woman I once knew, desperately grasping onto the remnants of our love. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of agony and dread, a soul-piercing scream erupted from Mia, a primal sound that reverberated through the very fabric of our home. The malevolent force expelled itself from her, a shadow darting through the air before dissipating into the dark corners of the room, banished for the moment. But victory came at a terrible price. Mia lay on the floor, breath shallow and rapid, her form appearing fragile and broken, and I soon noticed the devastation left behind, a nightmare made flesh. "Father, is she?" I stammered, dread clawing at my insides like the sharpest of knives, cutting into my heart. He shook his head solemnly, the weight of grief etched into his face, and it was clear he carried the burden of understanding that I was not yet ready to bear. "She has been saved, but the evil demanded a price," he replied quietly, words heavy with finality. It was then that I noticed, amidst the chaos and turmoil, the horror of her condition came crashing down on me. One of Mia's hands was a gaping void, a horrific sight where a hand should have been, blood seeping through the hastily applied bandages that Father Anton struggled to secure. I let out a strangled cry, my heart shattering at the sight of the woman I loved, forever altered and scarred by the darkness that had claimed her. She looked up at me, eyes brimming with tears, a mix of relief and anguish playing across her features, an ocean of emotion crashing within her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, soft and broken, and as I held her close, the warmth of her body grounding me in that moment, I realized the cost of our hard-won victory reached far beyond physical scars. It extended deep into the very fabric of our lives, changing us forever. In the weeks that followed, we struggled alongside the remnants of our shattered lives, attempting to rebuild what had been lost. Although the malevolent force had been cast out, leaving in its wake a hollow sense of dread that lingered in our home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lurked in the shadows, a predator waiting and watching for its opportunity to strike again. One evening, as I cleaned up the remains of another futile attempt at a normal dinner, an exercise that had begun to feel increasingly pointless, Jasper, who had fallen eerily silent since that dark night, suddenly hissed and darted into the living room as if possessed. My heart raced in response, each beat echoing in my ears as I followed him, finding him gnawing at something invisible, as if angered by an unseen presence. "Stop it!" I shouted desperately, the words spilling from my lips in a surge of emotional turmoil, but he only seemed to intensify his agitated response. Suddenly, I felt it, a chill that swept through the room like a ghostly breeze, the familiar echo of the night that had so fundamentally changed everything for us. "Mia!" I called, panic rising in my chest like a tide threatening to drown me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, wrapping around her as she emerged from the hallway, her expression a tumultuous mix of confusion and fear. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling as she looked around the room, searching for something she could not name. Before I could answer, the lights flickered violently, and then the air grew heavy with an oppressive weight that felt all too familiar. The malevolence that we thought was gone wasn't truly erased. It had only retreated into the dark recesses of our lives, waiting patiently for its chance to reclaim what it had lost. From that moment on, I realized the ongoing fight wasn't over. We had managed to survive the initial battle, but the war against the darkness encroaching on our lives was far from finished. Hand in hand, we would stand against it, navigating our way through the haunting whispers in the dark that threatened to engulf us, never knowing whether the fragile light of hope would prevail once more. It all began innocently enough, with a softness that felt almost magical. My girlfriend, Mia, was always a bit of a dreamer, often lost in the world of dreams and talking in her sleep. At first, This nightly chatter seemed simply adorable, sweet nothings that filled my heart with warmth and joy. I would often smile, amused as she mumbled about silly things that made no sense, her voice dancing through the layers of sleep like a gentle lullaby that transcended reality. I found comfort in these tender moments, a nightly reminder of the love we shared. But as time wore on, things began to shift in a way that I could never have anticipated. One fateful night, I found myself lying in bed next to her, the soft glow of the moon casting shadows across our dimly lit room. Everything felt serene and peaceful. At first, Mia was murmuring softly about a picnic we had planned for the weekend, her tone light and carefree, as if the world was a beautiful place filled with endless possibilities. However, as the night deepened, I began to notice a subtle but unsettling shift in her words. "Help me," she whispered suddenly, her voice trembling like the fragile flutter of a dying leaf caught in a fleeting breeze. My heart sank, and I brushed it off as just another one of her dreamy episodes, but deep inside, I felt an inexplicable unease unfurling within me, like dark tendrils creeping through my mind, wrapping around my thoughts. It was the next night when everything truly changed. Mia lay beside me, her face serene and calm under the moonlight at first, but as the clock ticked away into the early hours of the morning, something morphed within her, something I could not comprehend. Suddenly, she bolted upright, her once vibrant and lively eyes now vacant and hollow, devoid of the warmth that usually filled them. I gasped, the hairs on my neck standing on end as a wave of cold dread washed over me. "Darling," she intoned, but it wasn't her usual sweet voice that I adored. Instead, it resonated deeper, echoing in a way that sent chills down my spine, saturated with an unnatural aura that slithered under my skin. The way she stared at me with those lifeless eyes, as if I were some unrecognizable figure from a nightmare, sent icy tendrils of fear wrapping around my heart and squeezing it relentlessly. "Mia? Are you okay?" I stammered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I reached out, hoping to bring her back to me. She didn't respond. Instead, her lips curled into a twisted, almost grotesque smile, revealing an eerie stillness that felt far beyond her control. It was as if she was being puppeteered, her body a vessel for something sinister that had taken hold. In that dreadful moment, I was struck by a deep-seated dread that rooted itself within my soul. Though I had Mia physically present, somehow, the essence of who she was had vanished, and something dark and foreboding had taken her place. For the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in our once happy home grew progressively more oppressive, a weight that felt heavier with each passing night. Each evening, Mia would begin to speak in tongues, her voice slipping further and further from the person I once loved, each utterance laced with an unfathomable darkness. I watched helplessly as fear consumed her, her once joyful laughter transformed into harrowing cries for help that chilled me to the bone. I desperately tried to reach out, to comfort her, to bring her back to the surface, but each attempt was met with snarls that resembled more of a wild animal than the woman I had cherished for so long. Desperate for answers and feeling increasingly overwhelmed, I sought the help of a local psychic. The woman, old and frail with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see into my very soul, took one look at my trembling hands and declared, "She's not herself. There's a darkness clinging to her, feeding off her spirit in a way that I cannot articulate." Her words sent chills racing through me, igniting a sense of urgency I could no longer ignore. The psychic urged me to contact a priest known for his expertise in dealing with the supernatural, a real exorcist who possessed the strength and knowledge to confront such dark forces. I hesitated, disbelief gnawing at me from within. I was not the type to indulge in stories of the supernatural, yet as the nights grew darker and Mia's transformations intensified, I knew I had no other choice but to seek help. The day the exorcist arrived felt heavy with anticipation, like the thick air just before a violent storm. Father Anton was a robust man, with a presence that was both commanding and comforting, effortlessly drawing attention as he entered our home. As he stepped into our living room, a noticeable shift occurred in the atmosphere, a palpable tension hanging thickly in the air. It felt as if the very world around us held its breath, a silent promise that he would confront the evil that had invaded our lives. "Mia," he called softly, his voice steady and level, filled with authority. However, instead of the woman I loved, a low, guttural laugh erupted from her throat, a sound that clawed at my sanity, slicing through the fragile veneer of hope I clung to so desperately. "Leave. He cannot save you," she hissed, her face contorting in ways I never thought possible, a mask twisted by an unspeakable horror. Unfazed by her taunts, Father Anton stepped closer, unwavering in his resolve. He began to chant ancient incantations, his voice rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence like the tide sweeping in and out. But the darkness that had invaded Mia raged back with chaotic force, unrestrained and fierce. In that moment, her body twisted as if in pain, yet not under her own control. Something far more malevolent had firmly taken the reins, and I felt helpless to stop it. Suddenly, with a violent crash, my cat, Jasper, leapt from the shadowy corner of the room, hissing and clawing at the air like a creature possessed. It felt as if the very same force that was controlling Mia had suddenly shifted its focus onto him, as if he too had become a pawn in this dark game. He writhed and twisted, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and I realized too late that both Mia and Jasper were victims, entrapped by a malevolence far beyond my understanding. Panic settled heavily in my chest as I watched the exorcism unfold, feeling utterly powerless. The room filled with the acrid aroma of burnt sage, a sharp contrast to the sweet scent of our home, and the walls seemed to buzz with an unseen energy. I could see Father Anton straining against the ferocity of the evil, sweat beading on his furrowed brow as he raised a crucifix high, demanding the dark entity to flee. "Release them," he shouted, his voice a thunderous roar that seemed to resonate deep within my bones. The air thickened with tension, and I stood frozen, heart racing as I bore witness to this horrifying battle. As the struggle raged on, I felt a darkness creeping insidiously into my own heart. It was as though the malevolence twisting around Mia and Jasper was attempting to ensnare me too, to drag me down into its depths of despair. I fought against the urge to succumb, forcing myself to focus on the woman I once knew, desperately grasping onto the remnants of our love. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of agony and dread, a soul-piercing scream erupted from Mia, a primal sound that reverberated through the very fabric of our home. The malevolent force expelled itself from her, a shadow darting through the air before dissipating into the dark corners of the room, banished for the moment. But victory came at a terrible price. Mia lay on the floor, breath shallow and rapid, her form appearing fragile and broken, and I soon noticed the devastation left behind, a nightmare made flesh. "Father, is she?" I stammered, dread clawing at my insides like the sharpest of knives, cutting into my heart. He shook his head solemnly, the weight of grief etched into his face, and it was clear he carried the burden of understanding that I was not yet ready to bear. "She has been saved, but the evil demanded a price," he replied quietly, words heavy with finality. It was then that I noticed, amidst the chaos and turmoil, the horror of her condition came crashing down on me. One of Mia's hands was a gaping void, a horrific sight where a hand should have been, blood seeping through the hastily applied bandages that Father Anton struggled to secure. I let out a strangled cry, my heart shattering at the sight of the woman I loved, forever altered and scarred by the darkness that had claimed her. She looked up at me, eyes brimming with tears, a mix of relief and anguish playing across her features, an ocean of emotion crashing within her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, soft and broken, and as I held her close, the warmth of her body grounding me in that moment, I realized the cost of our hard-won victory reached far beyond physical scars. It extended deep into the very fabric of our lives, changing us forever. In the weeks that followed, we struggled alongside the remnants of our shattered lives, attempting to rebuild what had been lost. Although the malevolent force had been cast out, leaving in its wake a hollow sense of dread that lingered in our home. I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lurked in the shadows, a predator waiting and watching for its opportunity to strike again. One evening, as I cleaned up the remains of another futile attempt at a normal dinner, an exercise that had begun to feel increasingly pointless, Jasper, who had fallen eerily silent since that dark night, suddenly hissed and darted into the living room as if possessed. My heart raced in response, each beat echoing in my ears as I followed him, finding him gnawing at something invisible, as if angered by an unseen presence. "Stop it!" I shouted desperately, the words spilling from my lips in a surge of emotional turmoil, but he only seemed to intensify his agitated response. Suddenly, I felt it, a chill that swept through the room like a ghostly breeze, the familiar echo of the night that had so fundamentally changed everything for us. "Mia!" I called, panic rising in my chest like a tide threatening to drown me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, wrapping around her as she emerged from the hallway, her expression a tumultuous mix of confusion and fear. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling as she looked around the room, searching for something she could not name. Before I could answer, the lights flickered violently, and then the air grew heavy with an oppressive weight that felt all too familiar. The malevolence that we thought was gone wasn't truly erased. It had only retreated into the dark recesses of our lives, waiting patiently for its chance to reclaim what it had lost. From that moment on, I realized the ongoing fight wasn't over. We had managed to survive the initial battle, but the war against the darkness encroaching on our lives was far from finished. Hand in hand, we would stand against it, navigating our way through the haunting whispers in the dark that threatened to engulf us, never knowing whether the fragile light of hope would prevail once more. As a lighthouse keeper, my life has always been deeply intertwined with the solitude that comes with my position and the gentle whispers of the ocean that surround me. For 4 long years, my daily routine has revolved around watching from the towering heights of the lighthouse, where I let the waves crash against the rocks below and the winds howl fiercely in my ears. My job, while often monotonous and repetitive, possesses a unique charm that captivates me, especially at night. Under the vast expanse of the starry sky, the sea transforms into a mesmerizing canvas of endless black satin, its beauty both haunting and alluring. However, this serene and tranquil life that I had grown accustomed to changed completely when I stumbled upon those strange dolls on the beach. At first, I thought they were merely trash washed ashore, cruel remnants brought in by the relentless waves of the ocean. They were covered in grit and salt water, their eyes hollow and lifeless, as if they were silently telling a story that had yet to be uncovered. Intrigued by their presence, I picked them up and stored them away in the lighthouse's supply room, believing that maybe one day someone would come looking for them, yearning to reclaim what had been lost. As time passed, I began to realize that the appearance of these dolls was no mere coincidence. Each time I found a new doll on the beach, a wave of unease washed over me, sending chills down my spine. Their presence seemed inexplicably linked to a series of nearby missing person cases that had plagued the area. Whenever I caught sight of those dolls, the faces of missing children would flash vividly in my mind, as if they were silently crying out for help, pleading for someone to notice their absence and take action. Driven by a growing sense of responsibility, I began to try to find the owners of these forlorn dolls. Each time I discovered a new one on the beach, I would carefully examine its features, searching for any possible clues that might lead me to its rightful owner. Once, I found a doll hidden away in a dark corner, its clothes tattered and its face smeared with mud. I could feel it was different from the others, as if it held some secret that was waiting to be uncovered, a truth that had been buried beneath the sands of time. Compelled by curiosity, I decided to take this particular doll back to the lighthouse for further investigation. After a few days of searching for information, I finally found a photograph of a missing girl. Her name was Emily, and she was only 7 years old when she disappeared, last seen playing near the beach. In the photo, she wore a radiant smile that seemed to light up her face, and she looked strikingly similar to the doll I held in my hands. My heart sank at the realization, as if something deep within me had quietly shattered, leaving me feeling hollow and lost. The police investigation into the missing children made me even more uneasy. As they dug deeper into the cases, more and more missing reports were linked to these dolls. Every time I thought of those missing children, it felt like my heart was being squeezed tight, making it increasingly difficult to breathe. Those dolls seemed to become vessels for their souls, carrying their unfinished wishes and desires as they wandered the beach, trapped between two worlds. At night, I often found it hard to sleep, the sounds of those children's laughter and cries echoing hauntingly in my mind. Whenever I looked out at the dark, churning sea from the lighthouse window, an inexplicable fear would wash over me, enveloping me in its grip. The sound of the waves seemed to whisper secrets, reminding me that this ocean was not calm and held mysteries yet to be revealed. One particularly restless night, I decided to stroll along the beach, hoping to find more clues that might shed light on this unsettling mystery. The moonlight cast a silver glow on the sand, illuminating my path. As I walked to a secluded spot, I suddenly spotted a new doll lying quietly in the sand, its eyes glimmering faintly, as if calling out to me in a silent plea for help. A chill ran down my spine, yet I found myself unable to resist the pull of the doll. I carefully picked it up and examined it closely, feeling a strange connection to it. At that moment, a vivid vision flashed in my mind, a little girl playing joyfully by the sea, her laughter bright and clear, filling the air with innocence. But the image quickly blurred, her laughter swallowed by the waves, replaced by endless cries that echoed in the recesses of my mind. Panicking, I threw the doll away, filled with an overwhelming sense of fear. Back at the lighthouse, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my heart. Those dolls seemed to be warning me, urging me not to delve deeper into this dark mystery. Yet my curiosity surged like a tidal wave, impossible to suppress or ignore. A few days later, the police returned to the lighthouse to ask me about the dolls. I shared everything I knew, including the heartbreaking story of Emily. The officers' faces grew serious as they informed me that another child had gone missing recently, and the location of the disappearance was right where I had found the doll. I felt a wave of suffocation wash over me, as if the truth was closing in on me, trapping me in a web of despair. From that moment on, my life descended into an endless nightmare. Each nightfall, the sound of the waves felt like a call, a siren song preventing me from sleeping. The images of those dolls kept surfacing in my mind, as if they were trying to tell me their stories, begging for someone to listen. I began to doubt myself. Had I truly become the guardian of these missing children? What were they trying to convey to me, and why had I been chosen to bear this burden? Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to return to the beach once more, hoping to find more clues hidden in the sands. The moonlit beach looked particularly eerie that night, casting long shadows that danced along the shoreline, and my heart raced in my chest. As I reached the spot where I first discovered a doll, I suddenly felt a faint tremor beneath my feet. Looking down, I noticed a doll's hand barely emerging from the sand, a chilling sight that sent shivers down my spine. Fear gripped me tightly, yet I couldn't resist the allure of uncovering the truth. Carefully, I brushed away the sand and uncovered a doll, but this time its appearance sent chills cascading down my spine. Its face was marred with cracks, yet its eyes still glimmered faintly, as if watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Just as I was about to pick it up, I heard a low sobbing sound beside me. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but saw nothing in the darkness. Fear surged through me like a tidal wave, my heart raced, feeling an invisible force pushing me toward the doll. I reached out instinctively to touch it, and as my fingers brushed its face, a sharp pain shot through me, and countless blurred images flooded my mind, overwhelming my senses. Those images were filled with the laughter of children, their cries, and scenes of them playing joyfully by the sea. Their eyes were filled with fear and helplessness, as if pleading for my help, begging me to take action. I felt dizzy, my consciousness fading, and the cries grew clearer, more urgent. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, I heard a distinct voice say, "Help me." The plea resonated deep within me, igniting a fire of determination. I jolted awake, finding myself lying on the cold, hard floor of the lighthouse, surrounded by an eerie silence that felt suffocating. My heart was filled with fear and despair. I knew I had to do something, anything. The souls of those children were trapped on this beach, and I was their only hope, the only one who could help them find peace. I began to search for more clues, driven by a newfound sense of purpose, trying to find a way to unravel this intricate mystery that had ensnared me. Each time I found a new doll on the beach, I felt an invisible force calling to me, as if they were sharing their unfinished wishes and dreams. I started documenting the features of each doll meticulously, piecing together a complete story that would hopefully lead me to the truth. As my investigation deepened, I uncovered a horrifying secret behind these missing cases that chilled me to the bone. Many years ago, a tragic event occurred on this very beach when a little girl was swept into the sea while playing, never to return. Her soul seemed to wander in the waves, unable to find peace, and those dolls were her manifestations, carrying her sorrow and despair, echoing the pain of her loss. Realizing the gravity of the situation, I decided to return these dolls to the ocean, giving them a chance to rest and find solace. That night, I went to the beach and placed each doll into the water one by one, my heart heavy with emotion. The moonlight shimmered on the surface, illuminating the path for these lost souls, as if sending them off to a better place. Just as I placed the last doll into the sea, I heard that familiar sobbing, but this time it carried a sense of relief, a release from the pain that had bound them for so long. I felt a warmth wash over me, as if an invisible force was embracing me, wrapping me in a cocoon of comfort. Those dolls had finally found peace, their souls liberated from the torment they had endured. I would forever remember their stories, their laughter, and their cries, etched into my heart. Back at the lighthouse, I no longer felt fear. Instead, I felt a profound sense of calm and release. Although I was still the keeper of the lighthouse, I knew I had unraveled the secrets of this ocean, and the lost souls had finally found their redemption, free to roam the shores of eternity. Hope you enjoyed that spine-chilling experience. Now, let's move on to the next creepy tale. Ready to face more thrilling moments together? Let's dive into the next story right away. It was a sunny afternoon, and my friends and I were playing on the school playground. It was a carefree time, filled with laughter and joy. Our jumping figures sparkled in the sunlight as we gathered around the swings, slides, and even that little woods we often explored. Little did we know that Forrest was hiding something unusual. Kyle, our tall friend who always loved to joke around, suddenly suggested, "Let's go on an adventure in the woods." At first, everyone was excited and agreed. We rushed to the edge of the woods, our hearts full of curiosity and anticipation. As we entered the forest, sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground, with the leaves crunching softly beneath our feet. The deeper we went, the more the sounds around us seemed to fade into an unsettling silence. Just as we began to feel uneasy, Kyle suddenly shouted, "Come look at this." His voice was a mix of excitement and surprise. I quickened my pace, my curiosity piqued. When I reached Kyle, I saw him pointing at something on the ground, his face pale. He was crouched there, pointing at a black object. Its twisted shape looked like some unknown creature, covered in fine hair, giving off a suffocating stench. "What is this?" I whispered. Kyle just shook his head, his eyes betraying a hint of fear. The other friends gradually gathered around, all of them shocked. At that moment, the air seemed to grow heavier, and the trees emitted a low, mournful groan, as if warning us to stay away. We decided to leave the woods and head back to the playground. However, just a few steps out, a piercing alarm shattered the silence. The school's intercom blared an urgent announcement: all students return to classrooms immediately, no one is allowed outside. We exchanged confused and panicked glances. The teachers quickly ushered us back to the classroom, but everything felt different now. The room buzzed with whispers, everyone discussing what we had just seen. My mood grew heavier, as if an invisible hand was pressing down on my shoulders. Time dragged on, and the sunlight outside was gradually swallowed by thick clouds. Tension mounted in the classroom, and many began to cry softly. Our curiosity was completely replaced by fear. Just then, the school lights flickered, plunging the entire building into darkness. Teachers rushed to evaluate us, but in the chaos, we had no idea how to respond. Some screamed, others wept, and nearly everyone's face was etched with terror. Just as we were about to flee the classroom, Kyle's voice rang out from the back: "Someone's missing." Everyone froze, eyes darting around. I realized that one of my friends, Lucas, was nowhere to be found. We started screaming, searching for each other, but the chaotic noise drowned everything out. At that moment, time seemed to freeze, and we felt an immense psychological pressure. In the hours that followed, the school was engulfed in panic. Teachers tried to calm us down, but no one could explain what was happening. The constant blaring of alarms mixed with the approaching footsteps outside made me feel overwhelmingly trapped. Eventually, we were allowed to leave the classroom, but everything around us felt shadowy. The hallways were empty, and strange marks were left on the floor, as if reminding us of the terrifying events that had just unfolded. Back home, I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of that twisted creature and Lucas's disappearance. Days later, the school seemed to return to normal, but I knew everyone carried a deep shadow in their hearts. We could no longer play carefree on the playground. The sunlight could no longer dispel the invisible fear within us. The teachers tried to provide counseling, but the truth behind the disappearance remained a mystery. Some classmates became quiet, their eyes filled with an indescribable panic. Even though life appeared to return to normal, we all understood that this experience would forever leave a mark on our hearts, becoming an indelible fear. As time passed, Kyle and I sought the truth, eager to know what had happened to Lucas. So, we returned to those woods once more, filled with fear and speculation. The light still filtered through the branches, but the warmth was long gone. We found that everything in the darkness felt even more sinister. Entering the woods, we searched repeatedly, trying to find that twisted creature again. Yet, deep within the forest, there was only silence, as if waiting for something. Just when we were about to give up, Kyle suddenly stopped. His face turned pale as he pointed in a direction. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I listened, my heart full of unease. A low wailing sound came from afar, as if something was calling us. I shivered and wanted to turn back. But Kyle moved forward, his eyes reflecting a certain obsession. Despite the rising fear, I followed him, my anxiety flooding in like a tide. As we approached the source of the sound, the trees around us seemed to sway, emitting low moans. The noise grew closer, like a suffocating presence gradually revealing itself. We finally saw that black object, lying quietly as if waiting for something. At that moment, we could no longer think, we could only stare at that terrifying creature. Its twisted, dark shape was bone-chilling. Kyle trembled as he said, "This is what we saw before." I felt a strong fear that I couldn't articulate. Suddenly, the air around us froze, and the sound stopped. Then, I heard a deep voice, as if it came from the ground, "You're too late." That sentence echoed in the air, sending chills down my spine. Just as I wanted to run, Kyle stood frozen, a dazed expression on his face. I snapped back to reality and quickly grabbed him, filled with fear and unease. But he seemed lost in some kind of trance, completely unaware of the danger around us. I desperately pulled at him, not daring to stop. Finally, I managed to drag Kyle back, and we hurriedly ran towards the wood's edge. However, as we burst out of the woods, the low voice behind us locked onto me. I knew we could never turn back. That invisible hand clung to us like a shadow, making it impossible to escape. Back at school, the gloom in my heart couldn't be shaken off. Kyle's condition grew stranger. He was often silent, seemingly lost in memories. We decided to seek help from the teachers, but all explanations felt so hollow. Although the school returned to normal, and the teachers tried to restore our old lives, we all knew that Shadow would follow us for life. Months passed, and the investigation into the disappearance continued, with no clues about Lucas. Every time I looked at the playground, I felt not just childhood memories, but also that invisible fear. As night fell, dreams often brought back that twisted shadow, accompanied by a lingering anxiety and unease. Soon after, Kyle and I decided to return to the woods again, searching for the unresolved truth of the past. Armed with flashlights, we stepped back into that place that once terrified us. As the beam of light pierced the darkness, our hearts were filled with hesitation and trepidation. Suddenly, a gentle breeze blew through, and the surrounding trees whispered lowly, as if warning us that this place was unsafe. We continued deeper, but the woods tonight felt completely different. Darkness enveloped everything, and flickering lights occasionally caught our attention. It was an indescribable feeling, as if hidden eyes were watching us. Eventually, we reached the spot we had seen before, but the shadow before us had become even more indistinct, leaving only an eerie outline. Countless questions swirled in my mind. What is this? Did Lucas really disappear? Just when we felt powerless, the shadow began to take on a nearly real face. It was a twisted expression I couldn't describe, with a mocking smile at the corners of its mouth, eyes filled with endless sorrow and anger. For some reason, I felt a strong wave of fear, as if I would be swallowed whole in the next moment. Just as I tried to back away, Kyle behind me let out a scream and fell to the ground. My heart raced with panic, and as I turned to look, the shadow had vanished, leaving everything eerily silent. I bent down, trying to help Kyle up, but found his eyes vacant, as if his consciousness had drifted far away. My heart filled with urgency and helplessness. We could no longer escape this invisible fear. As time went on, the school tried to return to normalcy, but no matter how hard we tried, everyone carried that shadow in their hearts. I often dreamed of Lucas, Kyle, and those woods, while reality left me feeling increasingly lonely and helpless. In that fleeting moment, we all understood that some things could never be undone. I began to realize that those forgotten shadows would always accompany us, quietly influencing our lives. In our souls, there would always be a dark corner, hiding fears that couldn't be spoken. Even as time passed and the school returned to its former vibrancy and noise, I knew this experience would leave a deep imprint on everyone's heart, becoming a memory that was hard to erase. That shadow would forever loom over our playground, leaving an indelible mark deep within us. Alright, that's the end of today's story. Thank you for joining me on this thrilling journey through the shadows of life and death. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the little bell to get more spine-chilling tales from Whisper of Horror. Remember, every soul has a story, and here, we give them a voice. See you next time. Stay curious, stay cautious, and keep whispering horror.